This abandoned scared girl was spotted by a crocodile deep in the swamp. What the crocodile did next will leave you speechless. A small figure stumbled through the swamp, each step heavier than the last as her bare feet sank into the thick mud. Her breaths came in short gasps, her head whipping around at every sound. The snapping of branches, the rustle of unseen movement in the reeds. The swamp wasn't just quiet, it was expectant. Something was watching. She froze mid-step, her eyes locked on a dark ripple in the stagnant water nearby. For a long moment nothing happened, and she let out a trembling exhale. Then, with a sudden burst, a massive splash shattered the silence. A large bird, oblivious to its danger, was pulled under the surface in a violent flurry of feathers and water. The girl clapped her hands over her mouth to stifle a scream, stumbling backward as her eyes darted around. The ripple vanished, leaving the water unnervingly still once more. She didn't know what it was, but she knew she didn't want to find out. She turned and tried to run, but her foot sank deep into the muck, holding her in place like a trap. She struggled, twisting and pulling, her strength fading quickly. The splashing sound returned, this time closer. Her panic surged, and with a desperate yank, she freed herself, tumbling onto her hands and knees. Her frantic movement sent ripples across the surface of the swamp, and out of the corner of her eye, she saw something emerge. A sleek, dark silhouette that moved low in the water. It was massive, deliberate, and heading straight for her. The girl scrambled to her feet, but her leg gave out beneath her. She fell hard, her palms hitting the mud, and as she looked back over her shoulder, the shadow grew closer, the water behind it churning. And then it stopped, leaving only silence. The girl's hands trembled as she pushed herself upright, mud dripping from her fingers. Her chest heaved, the adrenaline coursing through her veins, but there was no time to rest. Every sound around her felt amplified. The faint rustle of leaves, the hollow plop of water shifting, the eerie hum of a swamp that never truly slept. She took a tentative step forward, her body tense, ready to bolt at the slightest movement. The air felt oppressive, heavy with a silence that seemed to mock her uncertainty. Her eyes darted in every direction, searching for a path that would lead her away from whatever was out there. But the swamp offered no comfort, no clear direction, only endless shadows and the thick, unrelenting mud that slowed every movement. And then she saw it. Half buried in the muck, just a few steps ahead, was something pale. At first she thought it was just a root or a rock, but as she edged closer, her breath caught. It was a bone. Her foot hesitated mid-step, her mind racing with possibilities. Was it an animal, or something worse? She glanced around again as though the answer might be hidden in the tangled reeds or murky water. That's when she noticed more, scattered remnants of what looked like clothing, shredded and filthy, clinging to a nearby branch. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the fabric. It felt brittle, as though it had been left to decay for far too long. Her stomach twisted, but she couldn't tear her eyes away. Then came the sound. A low, guttural noise, distant but distinct. It was impossible to tell if it was an animal or something else entirely. The girl froze, every muscle in her body locking in place as the noise came again, this time closer. She spun around, her heart hammering in her chest, but there was nothing there. Nothing except the water, dark and still, except for the faintest ripple moving across the surface. The noise returned, and with it, a sudden splash that broke the stillness. Her instincts screamed for her to move, but her legs felt rooted in place. She could only watch as the ripple grew larger, the unseen presence beneath the water drawing nearer. Something was coming. The girl's breaths were shallow, each one coming faster as the ripple in the water expanded toward her. Her legs finally obeyed, and she stumbled backward, her eyes glued to the surface. For a moment, everything went still again, but the silence felt heavier now, like the swamp itself was holding its breath. Suddenly, a massive shape broke through the surface. The crocodile's head, dark and gleaming, rose like a shadow made flesh. Its eyes locked onto her, unblinking and cold, as its body glided forward with terrifying precision. She didn't need to think. She turned and ran. Her feet pounded against the soggy ground, slipping on the wet mud as she pushed through low-hanging branches and tangled reeds. She didn't dare look back, but she could hear it. The water splashing, the heavy drag of something immense moving just behind her. Every instinct screamed that she wasn't fast enough. She spotted a narrow stretch of higher ground ahead and veered toward it, her lungs burning as she scrambled up. The moment her foot hit solid ground, she risked a glance over her shoulder. The crocodile had left the water now, its powerful legs propelling it across the mud with horrifying speed. Her heart dropped. This wasn't just some animal. This was a predator, and it wasn't giving up. Her eyes darted around desperately. A fallen tree lay ahead, its massive trunk sprawled across the swamp floor. She lunged for it, clambering up onto the slick bark. The reptile slowed, circling the base of the tree, its movements deliberate. Its tail swished lazily, as if it had all the time in the world. The girl clung to the trunk, her knuckles white as she searched for any weapon, any hope. Her fingers brushed against a jagged shard of wood jutting from the tree. She yanked it free, gripping it tightly, though the trembling in her hands betrayed her fear. Below, the crocodile seemed to sense her desperation. It lunged upward, its jaws snapping shut just inches from her foot. She yelped, jerking her leg away. The beast landed with a heavy thud, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it began circling again, each step slow and deliberate. Her mind raced. If she stayed, it would wait her out. If she ran, it would catch her. There was no escape. And then, just as despair began to take hold, she noticed something. The water beyond the crocodile's path began to ripple again. At first, it seemed insignificant, but the movement grew. Another shadow appeared, and then another. Her breath hitched. It wasn't alone. Before she could process what was happening, the largest crocodile she'd seen yet broke the surface, its jaws snapping open as it advanced toward her. There was no time left to think, only to act. The girl's fingers tightened around the jagged shard of wood, her pulse pounding in her ears. The two crocodiles circled below, their movements eerily synchronized, as if choreographed by some primal instinct. She glanced around, searching desperately for an escape, but the tree she clung to was the only thing keeping her from being dragged under. Then, without warning, the largest crocodile lunged. Its jaws snapped shut just below her perch, shaking the entire tree. She scrambled upward, barely keeping her footing as the beast retreated slightly, its yellow eyes never leaving her. The other crocodile mirrored its movements, creeping closer as if sensing her exhaustion. She couldn't stay here much longer. Her legs trembled from the strain of holding her balance, and her grip on the wood shard felt weaker with every passing second. Her mind raced, weighing options that all seemed equally hopeless. She couldn't outswim them. She couldn't outrun them, but she could fight. Her breathing steadied as she repositioned herself, bracing her back against the tree's trunk. She raised the shard, her eyes locked on the nearest crocodile. When it lunged again, its massive body surging upward, she struck. The jagged edge plunged into the soft flesh just above its snout. The creature let out a guttural hiss, thrashing wildly as it retreated into the water. But the victory was short-lived. The larger crocodile seized the moment, charging toward the tree with terrifying speed. She barely had time to react, leaping to a higher branch as its massive jaws slammed into the trunk. Her foot slipped, and for a heart-stopping moment, she dangled above the predators, her body swaying precariously. The shard of wood slipped from her grasp, disappearing into the murky water below. She clawed at the bark, her fingers raw and bleeding, until she pulled herself back onto the branch. The crocodiles weren't retreating. If anything, her resistance had only angered them. The larger one began ramming the base of the tree, each impact shaking it violently. Splinters rained down as cracks formed along the trunk. She had to move. Now. Her eyes scanned the swamp, locking onto a cluster of roots rising above the water a few meters away. It wasn't much, but it was the only option. Taking a deep breath, she steadied herself. The crocodiles circled below, as if sensing her next move. Then she jumped. Her body hit the mud with a heavy thud, and she scrambled toward the roots, her hands clawing at the slippery ground. The smaller crocodile reacted instantly, propelling itself forward with a terrifying burst of speed. She reached the roots just as the beast's jaws snapped shut inches from her leg. Her chest heaved as she pulled herself onto the tangled mass, her body trembling from the effort. But the roots were unstable, sinking slightly under her weight, and the larger crocodile wasn't far behind. It approached slowly, its movements calculated, its eyes locked onto her. The roots wouldn't hold for long. She could feel them shifting beneath her, threatening to give way. As the beast inched closer, her mind raced for a solution. Then, her eyes caught something. a metallic glint, half buried in the mud nearby. A forgotten machete, rusted but intact, just within reach. She hesitated, the crocodile now mere feet away, its jaws opening wide. With no other choice, she lunged for the blade. Her fingers wrapped around the rusted machete, its weight unfamiliar but reassuring. The girl's grip tightened as the larger crocodile moved closer, its powerful tail carving through the water with slow, deliberate strokes. She pulled herself upright, balancing precariously on the unstable roots, the blade raised defensively. The crocodile stopped, its massive head breaking the water's surface just a few feet away. Its eyes, dark and unblinking, seemed to measure her. For a fleeting second, neither moved. Then it lunged. The girl swung the machete with all her strength. The blade struck the crocodile's snout with a dull thud, forcing it to recoil slightly. She didn't wait to see if the blow had caused real damage. She scrambled back onto the roots, her heart hammering as she tried to plan her next move. The smaller crocodile circled behind her, cutting off any hope of retreat. She was trapped, the predators closing in from both sides. Panic surged through her, but she forced herself to focus. There had to be a way out. The roots beneath her shifted again, sinking further into the swamp. She risked a glance down and saw the water creeping higher, threatening to swallow her refuge. She couldn't wait any longer. Summoning every ounce of courage, she made a split-second decision. She jumped, landing hard on a patch of semi-solid ground a few feet away. The force of her landing knocked her off balance, but she kept moving, her legs burning with exhaustion. She stumbled toward a fallen tree in the distance, the machete still clutched tightly in her hand. Behind her, the crocodiles surged forward. The larger one moved with terrifying speed, its powerful body cutting through the water like a torpedo. The smaller one followed, its jaws snapping at the air as it closed the gap. She reached the tree and scrambled onto it, the bark slick under her bare feet. Turning quickly, she held the machete out in front of her, her arms trembling. The larger crocodile reached the base of the tree and paused, its massive head rising from the water. It seemed to study her again, its jaws opening slowly, revealing rows of jagged teeth. She swung the machete wildly, but the predator didn't flinch. Instead, it lunged forward, its weight crashing against the tree and nearly knocking her off. She managed to hold on, but her strength was fading, her body screaming for rest. And then she saw it. A rusted canister lying partially submerged in the mud nearby. Her mind raced as she pieced together a desperate plan. She dropped to her knees, gripping the machete in one hand while she stretched out with the other, her fingers straining to reach the canister. The crocodile lunged again, its jaws snapping shut inches from her leg. She grabbed the canister and pulled it toward her, the metal slick with grime. She turned it over, her eyes widening as she recognized the faded label, fuel. She wasted no time. Using the machete, she punctured the canister, spilling its contents across the tree and into the water below. The crocodiles hesitated, their movements slowing as the smell of fuel spread. She fumbled in her pocket, her fingers brushing against a single match she had found earlier. With trembling hands, she struck the match against the tree. The flame sputtered, weak but steady. She held it for a moment, her eyes locked on the larger crocodile, which had begun to move again. Then she dropped the match. The swamp erupted in flames. Fire spread across the fuel-soaked water, a wall of heat and smoke rising between her and the predators. The crocodiles thrashed violently, retreating into the deeper waters as the blaze consumed everything in its path. But the flames weren't stopping. The fire crept closer to the tree, and she realized too late that her escape route was gone. Trapped between the flames and the swamp, she had no choice but to jump once more. The girl hit the water hard, her body plunging beneath the surface. For a brief moment, everything was muffled. The roar of the flames, the snapping of branches, the distant thrashing of the crocodiles. She fought her way up, breaking through the surface with a gasp, her lungs burning as she gulped for air. The swamp was chaos. Flames licked the edges of the water, their reflection dancing erratically on the surface. Smoke hung thick in the air, stinging her eyes and throat. The heat was oppressive, but she couldn't stop moving. She clawed her way toward the shallows, her legs screaming in protest as she pushed through the thick mud. Behind her, the crocodiles had vanished, driven deeper into the swamp by the fire. She didn't know if they were gone for good, but for the first time, the relentless pursuit had stopped. Still, the danger wasn't over. The fire spread quickly, consuming everything in its path, and the ground beneath her felt unstable, threatening to give way at any moment. She stumbled onto firmer ground, collapsing to her knees. Her hands dug into the dirt as she tried to steady her breathing, her body trembling from exhaustion. Every muscle ached, her cuts and bruises stinging with every movement. But she was alive. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant crackle of flames and the occasional splash of water. She forced herself to stand, her legs wobbling as she took a step forward. Each movement was deliberate, her mind focused solely on finding a way out of the swamp. As she moved, her eyes scanned the area. The machete was gone, lost in the chaos, but she still had the knife she had used earlier. Her grip on it was tight, her knuckles white. She couldn't let her guard down, not yet. Ahead, she spotted a faint path cutting through the dense vegetation. It wasn't much, but it was a direction, a way forward. She followed it, her steps slow and deliberate, every sound making her flinch. The adrenaline was fading now, replaced by a bone-deep weariness that threatened to overwhelm her. But then, just as she began to think she might have escaped, a sound stopped her in her tracks. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible. A ripple. Her heart sank as she turned, her eyes scanning the water. It was still, unnervingly calm, but the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. She took a step back, her grip tightening on the knife. The ripple came again, closer this time. She couldn't see what was causing it, but she knew better than to wait and find out. She turned and broke into a run, her body screaming in protest as she pushed herself forward. The path twisted ahead, leading into dense undergrowth. She forced her way through, ignoring the branches that scratched at her skin. The sound of splashing grew louder behind her, and she risked a glance over her shoulder. There in the distance, something moved beneath the surface of the water. It was too far to make out clearly, but its size was unmistakable. Whatever it wasn't done with her. She burst through the last of the undergrowth, stumbling into a clearing. Ahead, she could see sunlight breaking through the canopy. Freedom was close, but the splashing behind her didn't stop. With one final burst of energy, she sprinted toward the light, her legs burning, her lungs straining for air. The clearing widened, and she saw what lay ahead, an old wooden bridge stretching across a narrow river. But as she reached the edge, the ground beneath her gave way. She fell, the world spinning as she plunged toward the water below, and the last thing she saw was the shadow waiting just beneath the surface.